Hello, and welcome to my session. This is Developer Day 2020 on the 12th of December. We've got our code of conduct here, just usual things. Be respectful of everyone, as I hope you have been all day. Be considerate and be open to everyone. This year, thanks to our sponsors and of course yourselves, we're supporting the National Museum of Computing, which I definitely need to get a visit to. And once all of this is all over, once lockdown's over, I'll hopefully make my way down there. And hopefully you will too. And here's some of our sponsors. We've got Black Marble, Microsoft, Sage up in the Northeast like myself, Grey Matter, NDC, Landmark, IO, and University of Hull. There's also NDC London between the 25th and the 29th of January 2021 to look forward to. If you're on Twitter, you can use the hashtag DDD2020, where you can tweet anything, including any questions to myself, and I'll answer those later. Or you can just tweet at the handle Developer Day, and of course, enjoy the day. So, this is my session about Spotify for developers. I'm Peter Bull. I don't actually work for Spotify, but I am interested in using it as a developer. I've got experience using Zune Music, Xbox Music, and Groove Music back in the day. As a developer, I even wrote a very successful Zune Social app for Windows Phone. So if you know what that is, then you probably downloaded it. Otherwise, you can find me on Twitter at Rogue Planetoid, and you can find what I'm up to most recently on GitHub and my website tutorialart.com. So developer.spotify.com. That's where you can discover how you can build experiences with Spotify for developers using Spotify, the music streaming and podcast service, which hopefully many of you out there are more than familiar with or probably even have an account with. So there, you can discover how you can develop unique Spotify-powered experiences that used by 180 million global music fans have used Spotify. And there's features available to developers such as audio features and analysis. There's playback, recommendations, search, playlists, metadata, curated content, and user taste as well. There's documentation you can read that has a complete reference for the entire Spotify Web API. And there's a console where you can try out all the Spotify Web API options online using sample data. And you can do that right from your web browser, or you can even get some curl requests as well that you can use locally as well. So use cases for common scenarios. You can integrate Spotify with home audio with Spotify Connect, of course. Voice integration, so you can create some immersive voice controlled experiences. You can even integrate with wearables such as smartwatches, health and fitness bands, and headphones. Or you can even innovate in emerging areas. Say there's some use case you've thought of that would be ideal for Spotify, then that's what you can do. So dashboard is basically where you create and manage your Spotify integrations. You just log in with a normal Spotify account and you agree to the terms and conditions. Then you just need to choose to create a client ID, which is you basically create an app or hardware integration. You just state the purpose of the non-commercial integration. If you happen to be doing a commercial integration, you can do that. You just need to get permission from Spotify to do that. Once you've done that, you'll get a client ID and a client secret, and that's basically what you use to interact with the Spotify API. Another important thing is you can edit the settings. So when you're doing authentication, you need to set a redirect URI, and that needs to be set there as well. But once you've set that all up, you're pretty much ready to go. So talking of authorization, that's basically how you authorize your app to get data or allow an end user to approve your application to access their Spotify data or features. So authorized request to Spotify, that requires permission to access that data, and it's all in accordance with OAuth 2.0, and the parties involved are the end user who's using your application, the application itself, and the Spotify server. There are scopes that allow your application to access specific API endpoints. So there's images, Spotify Connect, playback, user information, playlists, library features, listening history, and follow. So you obtain authorization from the user by redirecting to a page. That's where they can log into Spotify. It's very similar to the one if you've logged into Spotify itself, you'll recognize this dialog. The next part is the requesting the information they need to access. So depending on what scopes you've added, the list of things that you have access to will change. So you only need to access what you need to use and what actions need to be performed. So there's a few flows for authorization. Let's go through those. So the authorization code flow, that's designed for long-running applications. So the user just grants permission the first time, and then you can refresh an access token for subsequent times. Here's the diagram. Looks a bit complicated, but don't worry, it's not as complicated as it seems. So this is the type of flow that you perform on a back-end service. So you wouldn't do this in a web browser or a mobile application. So the first thing the application does is the user would log in and authorize access. And then the next part is you can basically request refresh tokens and access tokens. You get those returned in a redirect URI, and then you can use that access token itself to access the Spotify web API. Those do expire after a short time. That's where the refresh token comes in, where you can basically request another one when needed. The first request, your application requests authorization. So you just build a URL, and that needs to contain parameters such as the client ID. And you can see an example of that there. So the required parameters are shown in bold. So once redirected, the user can accept the request, and then your application will be redirected to to your redirect URI with a code parameter. However, if the user decides to deny that request or there's a problem, you'll get an error returned on your redirect URI as well. And both of these requests will include a state parameter if you've provided that. Then, secondly, your application can actually request the refresh and access tokens, and you provide a header with a base64 encoded string containing the client ID and the client secret. That's what you get from the Spotify dashboard when you signed up, and then the body parameter includes that code you got from the access code response. And then the response when you perform a post request to the token endpoint, you'll get a result. And if that's successful, you'll get a status code of 200, and you'll get these values, which includes the access token itself, which you can use with the Spotify API, and a refresh token. To actually use that refresh token, you can provide a request with these header and body parameters, and from the authorization code response I just mentioned. So it's pretty simple. And then when you perform a post to the token endpoint with those parameters, again you'll get a result, a success status code of 200, and you'll get a new access token, and you can simply keep using the same refresh token to get a new access token every time it expires, so you can keep the user logged in. A similar flow is authorization code with PKCE, or proof key for code exchange. That's the best option for a mobile or desktop application. So similar to the first, but this time it would be a client application. So you don't store the client secret in this case, you just use the client ID. So this is much safer for that kind of use case, but it can also be refreshed. So the flow, basically the first thing you need to do in this case, you need to create a code verifier. So that's a cryptographically random string, and then you need to hash and encode that to create a code challenge. Then you just construct an authorization URI where the user will log in and authorize access like the previous one. And then you'll use the code returned to get a access token along with a refresh token similar to the other flow. And again, you can use that refresh token to get a new access token. So the first thing before you do anything is you need to generate that code verifier. As I said, it's a cryptographically random string. It's between 43 and 128 characters, and it can be letters, digits, underscores, periods, hyphens, or tildes. And then you just need to SHA-256 hash that and encode it with base64 URL, and that gets you the code challenge. Then you just need to have your request request authorization, and you provide the code challenge you generated in this request. If the user accepts that request, they'll be redirected to your redirect URI that you would have specified in those settings in the dashboard, and you'll get the code parameter. If they deny it, again, you'll get an error and a state value if that was provided. The code verifier request itself, second, your application can request the refresh and access tokens you need. That's where you provide the client ID, and you also need to provide the code from the code challenge response and the code verifier that you generated, and that will authenticate your request is valid. And you can see an example of it there. And then in the response, you'll get an access token back and a refresh token as well. With that refresh token, you can then request a new access token. So you just provide these parameters. A bit different from the other one. You'll need to provide the client ID in this case, but no time you providing the client secret. And the response to this, again, with a success code, you'll get a refreshed access token. So again, as that token expires, you can keep renewing it. You don't have to ask the user to log in again. Implicit grant flow, that's generally designed for clients that are implemented in a browser, like a JavaScript client. And in this case, there aren't any refresh tokens. So you have your application request authorization, and the access token will be returned as a hash fragment, this time on the redirect URL, and you'll get the access token that way. So you construct a request like this, where the user will log in and authorize access, and you provide the client ID from the Spotify dashboard. You can see an example there. And then in the response, you'll get back the access token as that'll be encoded in a query string, but as a hash fragment. However, if the user doesn't grant access or there's a problem, you'll get redirected to your redirect URI as a query string. Good to know that that's different for an error. So it's not a hash fragment in that case. It'll be on the query string. And again, this will return the state value if provided. Client credentials flow, that's for server-to-server authentication. But with this one, you can't access any user information. So it's a bit simpler, this one. You just have to request authorization and an access token will be returned. And you can use that to access the Spotify API. And all you need to do is provide a header with the base64 encoded client ID and client secret, and then the simple body parameter of client credentials. And in the response, you'll get an access token returned, but there's no refresh token in this case, and there's no user data you can use with that one. You can use that with any calls to Spotify Web API that don't access user information. Okay, talking of the Spotify Web API, what does it do? So it allows you to basically have your applications retrieve content such as album data, playlists, and more from Spotify. So the Spotify Web API endpoints are based on simple REST principles, and they've returned JSON metadata about artists, albums, and tracks. You can also get user-related data like playlists and music that they save in their library. The requests to the Spotify Web API are performed using standard HTTPS in UTF-8 format, and where possible use the appropriate HTTP verbs. So that would be get, post, put in, delete in the case of Spotify. So the requests include the albums API, so you can get an album. You can get artist API data, like the top tracks for an artist. There's the browse API, so you can get all the categories, for example. And there's the episode API, where you can get multiple episodes. Also, you can get requests including the follow API, so you can get like a user's followed artists. There's the library API, so you get a few different things here. such as the getting a user saved shows. That's podcasts. That's how Spotify refers to them internally. Next, you can get personalization for a particular user. So you can get their users' top tracks and artists. Or you can use the player API that allows you to control user playback. That's using Spotify Connect itself. So if they're playing music back from a device, you can control that playback, pause, play, and you can also get recently played tracks and a myriad of other things you can see there. Then there's the playlists API. So there's a few things you can get from there. You can get a playlist items and other things too. You can search for an item. So that's the albums, artists, playlist, tracks, shows, podcasts, and episodes that you can get. And then you can get the shows themselves. You can get the show's episodes, for example. Finally, you can get the tracks APIs and get like audio features for a track, which tells you interesting stuff about the track itself. And then finally, there's the user profile API. So you can get a current user's profile, such as their username. The responses, they're just JSON format, and they return with a HTTP status code for a success, or if there's a problem, you'll get an error code. This is the list of objects themselves. There's an album object, an artist object, and a track object, and various others representing various things in Spotify. And if anything goes wrong, you'll get an error object back. So there are Spotify SDKs available, and they help developers take advantage of the Spotify API. The Web Playback SDK, that's a client-side JavaScript library that allows you to create a new player in Spotify Connect, and you can play any audio track from Spotify in a web browser. Next, there's the Spotify iOS SDK that allows access to the Spotify API, and it supports things such as playing a track using the Spotify app in the background and responding to changes in the playback state. There's the Android SDK. It's very similar to the iOS one. Again, supports features like playing tracks in the Spotify app, and you can also subscribe to the player state. Finally, there's third-party SDKs that are available for other platforms such as .NET and the Universal Windows platform, and you can find those on NuGet. The Spotify Web Playback SDK, that contains Spotify.player. That's basically a JavaScript object that allows you to take control of music playback and return related events, errors, and objects. So you can basically start a player in your browser, and then you can control it from the API as well. The Spotify iOS SDK, which I mentioned before, that allows an iOS application to authenticate users, and you can interact with the main Spotify application running in the background, and it'll always stay in sync. So basically, you can offload all the complexity of that to the Spotify application, so you don't have to worry about playback, authentication, networking, or offline caching. That's all dealt with the actual Spotify application itself, so you don't have to worry about that. The Spotify Android SDK, that again allows you to interact with the Spotify app on the device. It basically contains a set of lightweight objects that you connect to the application itself, and you can again offload playback, networking, and offline caching. There's also OS music integration, and there's also a streamlined experience as well on Android. And again, playback is always in sync with your application as it is with Spotify's. There are third-party SDKs available, as I mentioned, for .NET Standard and the Universal Windows platform. As mentioned, those are available on NuGet. First of these is called Spotify.NET Standard. That covers the Spotify Web API and is my own Spotify SDK. And that's available right now on NuGet. And that can be installed into any .NET Standard 2.0 compatible runtimes. That's .NET Core, .NET Framework 4.8, or of course .NET 5. There's full source code available on GitHub, and there's also unit tests and full documentation there as well. Spotify.NET Standard.SDK, that wraps the previous one, and this adds extra support to that one, such as commanding and rich data binding enhancements. So that makes it even easier to build Spotify applications, again, supporting .NET standards. So you can use this with Xamarin, WinUI, and WPF. And again, is available on NuGet right now. And there's full documentation, unit tests, and source code on GitHub. Then there's Spotify.uwp that extends the previous one, and this just adds dedicated support for the Universal Windows platform. So that allows you to use lists as observable collections, that allows you to support incremental loading, so you can have a nice infinite scroll experience, and that's available on NuGet right now, and that supports the Windows 10 Fall Creators update from 2017 or later. So if you've got the recent version of Windows 10, your users can use this no problem. And again, there's full source code, unit tests, and documentation available on GitHub as well. Okay, so I'll show you how you can easily create an experience with Spotify for developers as a .NET developer. So I'll switch over to my Visual Studio, which hopefully you can all see. And this is just a simple ASP.NET Core Razor page application. So I've just created a default application and I've got the index page here. So we've got a section for authorization. So we've got the 4 flows. We've got authorization code flow with PKCA as well, implicit grant. Then I've got every single one of the API calls are implemented here. So we've got search, for example, get all categories. Basically everything you saw in the previous slides is implemented there, just using the tag helpers. If I go to the code and I scroll up to the top. So here we've got my SDK is already loaded into this application, and we're just newing up an object. It's just an interface. We're passing in the client ID and client secret. That's all this needs. And then there's just a few other values just for the example. Here I'm managing the redirect from the authentication process. So I'm differentiating the 2 authorization code flows here. I've just got a flag that allows me to tell which one it is, so I know to do the right thing, because you don't know which one it is when it comes back. And there's some other code to manage the authorization. So the authorization flow is very, very straightforward. It's all taken care of. And then I've got some calls here, so I could search for an item. I just pass in the string value and various options. So very, very straightforward. So what I'll do is I'll run that example. Just let that load. So here we are. So I'm not logged in yet. So for example, I can choose the client credentials flow, and that only loads a certain subset of the API calls because this is not the user calls that this supports. So I can do get all categories, and if I scroll down the bottom, there's all the categories there, and I can even select a category. Let's get 2020, and I can, for example, get the categories playlists. So that's all the playlists that are in that category. But I can also use the authorization code flow to get the user information. So this will log me into Spotify. So it's just got me. So you log into your own Spotify account and then just log in. Here it's asking me all the things. I've got this example asking for everything, which you probably wouldn't normally do, but you can see that it's disclosing everything that it have access to, my top artists. It can control my devices and all the playback. So the user knows exactly what your application is going to do. So I just agree to that. So now I've got some extra options here. So I can get a list of my playlists. I can, save my shows. So I can change which shows podcasts I'm listening to. I can skip my playback. I can't play anything back in this demo, unfortunately. But you can basically anything you can do in the Spotify API, this application supports. And yeah, you can just you can basically use this really easily, and the other flows work in very much the same way. There's just a little bit of code to handle the implicit grant one, because that uses a little bit of JavaScript just to cheat it there. But I'll go down and show a few bit more of the code. So again, when I get a category, I just say get category. I pass in the name of the category, and I get a result back, which is a category object. So basically, there's there's an object for every type, and it matches the objects as they are specified in the Spotify API. So whatever values a particular object can return, you can get that here, and they're all named to match. This particular interface supports the exact naming as used in Spotify for developers. There is another client that it supports, which makes things a little bit easier if you want to sort of roll some things together. But this one just makes it really easy to sort of make all the calls, like getting all the new releases. So that's one way you can use my libraries, but there's another application I've got here. So this is a Universal Windows Platform application. I've called it Spotify Showcase, and it's basically using my Spotify.uwp library, and again supports every single feature. There's a little bit of a flickering glitch just due to the streaming, but if ignore that. So if I go to 2020, I can view the playlists. I can go into a playlist. I can check out the artists, so it's quite quick. I sometimes think this is faster than the Spotify application. I might be a bit biased, but I'm sure it is. But it probably isn't. But it's a fully UWP experience. This is not a web application. If I open my featured playlists and new releases, I can scroll down and you can see there's infinite scrolls supported there. So yeah, very simple. Everything you'd recognize in the Spotify application would be here, and you know, you can get the current. If I was playing a track right now, it would tell me exactly what was playing, what point it was playing to. So everything is supported here. So it's basically a good way of sort of seeing what you can do with the, you know, with everything that you can access with the API. Just go into a playlist, for example. So pretty simple. This is some of the audio analysis data. I'm just showing them in charts. You can see how danceable, or if it's an instrumental. So it's really easy, you know, you can check out your latest songs and stuff like that. But yeah. Okay. So the first demo you can find on my GitHub, and that's just basically Spotify for developers. It's based on an example I wrote for my workshops. So if you just go to that address, github.com/rogueplanetoid/Spotify for developers, you'll find this demo. You'll also find the slides for this presentation as well. And you can try it out for yourself. It's just and it's in .NET 5 as well, so it's well up to date. The other example is the Universal Windows Platform one. So if you're still into your Universal Windows Platform, then you can see how you can use Spotify in that with every feature supported, user information, categories, pretty much everything that the Spotify API offers, you can do in this application. And you can feel free to copy it, get inspired. That's what it's for. So, in summary, Spotify for developers, that allows developers to create their own Spotify-powered experiences. Developer.spotify.com, that's where you get started. You can find all the documentation, try out all the API calls online, and create the client ID and client secret you'll need to use the Spotify API in your applications, and much more besides. The authorization has got those 4 flows. There's the refreshable user authorization with the authorization code flow and authorization code flow with proof key for code exchange. There's refreshable app authorization with the client credentials flow, and there's temporary user authorization with the implicit grant flow. Spotify Web API endpoints, they're just simple, based on simple REST principles, and return JSON metadata about music, artists, albums, tracks, anything you can get from the Spotify catalog pretty much. And then there are SDKs available, and those include the Web Playback SDK, which allows you to create a player in Spotify Connect. There's iOS and Android SDKs if you develop for those platforms. And there's also third-party SDKs for many platforms, but most of all for .NET Standard and Universal Windows Platform, the ones that I've wrote myself. And yeah, you can basically get started as a .NET developer just using those, but the API itself is pretty straightforward. And that's it. As I said, if you want to get started, check out developer.spotify.com. Or if you want to get in touch, you can send me a tweet on Twitter. I'm at Rogue Planetoid. Or you can check out my GitHub github.com/rogueplanetoid. I have this example, as I mentioned, and the slides as well there. And I also have all the source code for the SDKs available with unit tests and everything else. And I have my website tutorialr.com, where I have a full workshop for Spotify. It needs to be updated for the PKCE authentication. But yeah, you can work through that workshop and I'll take you step by step and pretty much build the example that I showed in the demo. And yeah, that's basically how you can get started. That's me. If there's any questions.